All rise, veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. Lord John the Court Panel International at 08. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Court officer, could you call the case, please?
Good afternoon, Madam President. Good afternoon, Your Honors. This is the situation in the Republic of Mali in the case of the prosecutor versus Al Hassan Al Abdul Aziz Ag Mohammed Ag Mahmoud, case reference ICC 0112-118. And for the record, we are in open session.
Thank you very much. May I have the appearances, please? Mr. Deputy Prosecutor.
Madame le Président, Madame, Monsieur les juges, le bureau du procureur est représenté aujourd'hui par moi-même, Mamanya Aignan, procureur adjoint. J'ai à ma droite le premier substitut, M. Gilles Duterte, Madame Paola Sachi, qui est juriste adjointe de deuxième classe, et Madame Sandra Scotters, qui est également substitut du procureur adjoint de première classe. Au deuxième rang, j'ai Moussa Alafi, qui est substitut du procureur adjoint de première classe, Madame Diane Looping, qui est substitut du procureur, Yayo Yamaguchi, qui est aussi substitut adjoint de première classe, et enfin, Monsieur Richard Zanza Baganwa, qui est notre conseiller en coopération. Et au troisième rang, dernier rang, nous avons Madame Marie-Jeanne Sardacti, qui est substitut du procureur, Monsieur Lucio Garcia, qui est également substitut du procureur, Monsieur Karim Tonti, qui est notre case manager, et enfin, Monsieur James Mawira. Voilà. Aujourd'hui, c'est l'équipe qui compose le bureau du procureur et j'en profite également pour donner le bonjour à l'équipe de la défense et aussi aux représentants des victimes. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. May I have the appearances for the defense, please, Ms. Taylor?
Good afternoon, Madam President. Good afternoon, Your Honours, and good afternoon to all my colleagues in the courtroom and around the courtroom. The defence for Mr. Al Hassan is represented today by Cassidy Gary, Aka Pradhan, Melissa Bellier-Lucier, Havneet Sethi, we have Mihim Weber, Malud Al-Ansari, Claudia Barrera Pinheiro, Gabrielle Regimbal, and Ibrahim Ag Mohammed, and myself, Melinda Taylor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Taylor. The legal representatives of victims, please.
Bonjour, Madame le juge président, honorable Madame la juge et honorable Monsieur le juge. L'équipe de représentants légaux des victimes est représentée à cette audience. Je vais commencer par le terrain, donc qui nous suivent et qui suivent l'audience depuis Bamako, par Maître Sédou Doumbia, Monsieur Maïga Boubacar et Madame Janine Kapinga. Et depuis Bruxelles, Maître Gilly Goffin. Et ici à l'audience, j'ai à ma droite Madame Kapinga, Madame Biyeke Dipanga Prisk et Monsieur Morales Andrés. Et enfin moi-même, Maître Ntita Louvenguika. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. In today's hearing, Trial Chamber 10 of the International Criminal Court delivers its sentencing judgment in the case of the prosecutor versus Al Hassan. By a decision of the presidency, the chamber sits in a new composition compared to the one that delivered the trial judgment in this case earlier this year on 26th of June, with Judge Kipong Pek replacing Judge Mindua. The present summary conveys the findings in the sentencing judgment that are most relevant to the public. The Chamber's detailed reasoning is set out in the written sentencing judgment, which is the only authoritative document. That judgment will be published and made available to the public shortly after this hearing today. Je vais maintenant poursuivre en français. Le prononcé de la peine est une étape cruciale dans cette affaire qui a commencé en 2020 et dans laquelle M. Al-Hassan a été condamné pour certains crimes de guerre et crimes contre l'humanité commis à Tombouctou entre mai 2012 et janvier 2013 et acquitté pour d'autres. La phase de prononcer de la peine représente en effet une opportunité particulière de reconnaître la souffrance et le préjudice causés aux victimes des crimes concernés. Ce préjudice, notamment en ce qui concerne le crime de persécution qui a visé l'ensemble de la population de Tombouctou en 2012-2013, est conséquent et a eu des répercussions à long terme. Ce stade de l'affaire met en exergue l'importance de la reconnaissance de la responsabilité des auteurs des crimes, du préjudice causé aux victimes et de l'engagement de la communauté internationale de condamner les crimes graves commis dans cette affaire. I will now continue in English. Turning to the determination of the sentence, the prosecution in this case recommended a joint sentence of no less than 22 years imprisonment. The legal representatives of victims conveyed statements from their clients that Mr. Al-Hassan should stay in prison for a long time or be given a life sentence. The defense recommended a sentence of time served. In its sentencing judgment, the Chamber addresses sentencing in two steps as required by the ICC's legal framework. First, the Chamber pronounces an individual sentence for each of the 8 crimes for which Mr. Al-Hassan was convicted. Second, the Chamber specifies a joint sentence. In determining the individual sentences, the Chamber assesses the gravity of the crimes, including the degree of Mr. Al-Hassan's participation and intent, as well the presence of any aggravating or mitigating circumstances, and Mr. Al-Hassan's individual or personal circumstances. In discussing the crimes, the Chamber has grouped crimes together which are underpinned by the same or similar conduct. In making some overall comments on the degree of Mr. Al-Hassan's participation and intent as regards the various crimes, the Chamber emphasizes that Mr. Al-Hassan's liability for the majority of his conviction is based on his contribution to crimes committed by other members of the group Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM. His responsibility in this context arises primarily due to his role within the Islamic police, which was set up by these groups in Timbuktu in 2012, 2013, and the role of the Islamic police in the repressive system created by Ansar Dine AQIM. The nature of each of these roles was considerable. At the same time, Mr. Al-Hassan was not a central figure in the Ansar Dine AQIM leadership apparatus, and he was not among the persons within Ansar Dine AQIM who designed the group's criminal common purpose. The Chamber rejects the defense's overall characterization of Mr. Al-Hassan's role and participation in and contribution to the various crimes as minimal, but also declines to find that the crimes in this case are aggravated, as suggested by the prosecution and legal representatives of victims, by Mr. Al-Hassan's zealous use of his role or by an abuse of authority. In its crime-specific analysis, the Chamber finds the crime of persecution in this case to be of serious gravity. This crime was committed on a significant scale in which the entire population of the city of Timbuktu was targeted and was the subject of the deprivation of fundamental rights. The crime was also committed over a substantial time period spanning May 2012 to January 2013. Restrictions imposed by Ansar-Dine Hakim impacted all aspects of the life of the people of Timbuktu, forbidding or placing strict restrictions on religious, traditional, social, and cultural practices and daily activities. The acts had a significant reach, regulating the conduct of individuals in the public space and in the privacy of their homes, and were violently imposed through surveillance and punishment, including acts of violence, force, intimidation, confiscation, and destruction. This regime and these acts had a traumatic effect on the population of Timbuktu, which lived in an atmosphere of fear, violence, oppression, and humiliation, and remains present in the minds of victims in a deep-seated trauma. Some victims targeted were particularly vulnerable, being children and the elderly, and the restrictions imposed also had a specific and disproportionate impact on female members of the Timbuktu population. It affected their ability to work and earn money, and they lived in constant fear of arrest and punishment, which, as expressed during the trial, could happen whatever they did to respect the rules and prohibitions. For some, the atmosphere of fear was such that they no longer left their homes. While the Chamber is aware of the disappointment expressed by many victims in the acquittal of Mr. Al-Hassan by majority of some crimes in the trial judgment, in particular sexual violence crimes and persecution on gender grounds, the Chamber has explicitly highlighted this specific impact of the convicted crimes of persecution on female victims in the sentencing judgment. The Chamber also finds the crimes of torture, other inhumane acts, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, and mutilation to be of serious gravity. These crimes concerned punishments, namely floggings and the amputation of a victim's hand, for breaches of Ansar-Dine Hakim's rules and prohibitions. In assessing the gravity of these crimes, the Chamber emphasizes their public nature, being punishments mostly proclaimed in advance and carried out in front of large crowds of people, including children. The carrying out of the punishments in this humiliating manner, in the forum of a public spectacle, not only heightened the distress and suffering experienced by those who were punished, but also exposed members of the Timbuktu population, including those children, to scenes of abject violence. Again, some of the punishment victims were particularly vulnerable, being children or elderly. The impact on the victims was significant and often had long-term consequences. These crimes were also committed on a discriminatory basis on religious grounds to deter the population of Timbuktu, whom Ansar-Dine Hakim considered as ignorant and not real Muslims, from violating the group's rules and prohibitions. In relation to the degree of Mr. Al-Hassan's participation and intent, apart from instances where his liability for these crimes was based on his contribution to the relevant crimes, Mr. Al-Hassan also directly perpetrated the crimes of torture and outrages upon personal dignity against two individuals whom he personally flogged. Further, he aided, abetted, or otherwise assisted the commission of the same crimes against 8 individuals through his presence and participation at their flogging, where he ensured the security of the events and the efficient and effective implementation of the sanctions in his capacity as a key member of the Islamic police. Finally, the Chamber finds the crime of sentencing without due process, in this case, while still grave, to be of less serious gravity in the specific circumstances before us than other crimes under consideration. Mr. Al-Hassan's case represents the first conviction at the International Criminal Court for this crime, which concerned, in this instance, sentences handed down in the form of physical punishments without a previous judgment by a court, and judicial sentences passed by the Islamic court established by Ansar Din Hakim in Timbuktu during the relevant period. This court did not afford the essential guarantee of independence and impartiality due to its control by Ansar Din Hakim's leadership and the promotion in the court of their interests. This crime was committed in a systematic manner over a substantial period of time between May 2012 and January 2013 against 49 individuals. The victims also again included children and the elderly, and some of the sentences executed were violent and resulted in significant harm. Certain features of the proceedings before the Islamic court were also unfair for accused persons. Mr. Al-Hassan had a comparatively high degree of participation and intent in this crime, in light of the fact that his liability is based on his contribution to Ansar Din Hakim's system of repression, and in particular his involvement in the work of the Islamic court as a member of the Islamic police. In respect of 15 of the victims, Mr. Al-Hassan had a higher degree of involvement in their cases, noting he wrote the police reports concerning them. Finally, there were some positive aspects to the Islamic court. Notably, the institution was created partly to fill a justice and security vacuum in the region after the departure of the Malian authorities, and to provide a forum for locals to resolve their disputes. However, collateral or positive aspects of the work of the Islamic court in general cannot, as alleged by the defense, in any way lessen the gravity of the crime of sentencing without due process for which Mr. Al-Hassan has been convicted. The prosecution and legal representatives of victims has argued that several aggravating factors were applicable to the convicted crimes, including multiplicity and defenselessness of victims, particular cruelty in the conduct of the crimes, and discriminatory motive. The Chamber declines to characterize these factors as aggravating, instead taking some of them into account in assessing the gravity of the relevant crimes, like number and particular vulnerability of victims, and the way the crimes were carried out. Finally, in determining the individual sentences, the Chamber also considers the personal circumstances of Mr. Al-Hassan and mitigating circumstances put forward by the defense. The defense argued that many such circumstances warranted a reduction in the sentence, including expression of remorse and Mr. Al-Hassan's personal circumstances at the time of the events. Of these, the Chamber finds that only 2 circumstances can be taken into account in mitigation. The first is good actions undertaken by Mr. Al-Hassan to assist the civilian population in 2012-2013. However, these actions were minor in nature and cannot only be accorded very limited weight in the determination of Mr. Hassan's sentence, particularly considering the nature of the crimes for which he has been convicted. The second is Mr. Hassan's cooperation with the prosecution at the investigation stage of this case, which materialized in lengthy statements introduced into evidence and relied on in the trial judgment. On this subject, the Chamber finds unpersuasive the prosecution's submission that Mr. Hassan's cooperation was negated by his later unsuccessful objection to the introduction of his statements into evidence. However, importantly, the existence of these mitigating circumstances should not be understood as lessening in any way the gravity of the crimes that were committed, including the impact they had on the victims. Mr. Hassan, at this stage, I would ask you to please stand. Thank you. Weighing and balancing all the relevant factors, the Chamber pronounces the following individual sentences. For other inhumane acts as a crime against humanity and cruel treatment as a war crime, which concerned the flogging of one individual, 2 years each. For the war crime of mutilation, which concerned the amputation of the hand of one individual, 5 years. For the war crime of sentencing without due process, 6 years. For the war crime of outrages upon personal dignity, 8 years. For torture as a crime against humanity and as a war crime, 9 years each. And for persecution as a crime against humanity, 10 years of imprisonment. This also constitutes the highest individual sentence. This sentence, related to persecution, is pronounced by majority, with Judge Akani considering that 8 years was appropriate for the reasons expressed in the judgment. According to the court's legal framework, the Chamber shall now pronounce a joint sentence. This joint sentence cannot be lower than the highest individual sentence, which is 10 years in this case, and cannot be higher than 30 years imprisonment unless there are exceptional circumstances. In this particular case, taking into account the substantial overlap between various crimes, the Chamber sentences you, Mr. Hassan, to a joint sentence of 10 years imprisonment. The Chamber considers that this joint sentence is proportionate to the gravity of the crimes and the individual circumstances and culpability of Mr. Hassan. It adequately reflects the strong condemnation by the international community of the crimes committed by him and acknowledges the significant harm and suffering caused to the victims. It is also adequate with a view to deterring others from committing similar crimes in the future and discouraging Mr. Hassan's own potential recidivism. Mr. Hassan, you may be seated. Finally, the Chamber notes the time spent in detention by Mr. Hassan in accordance with an order of this court, namely since 28 March 2018, will be deducted from the sentence imposed on him today. The Chamber, in its discretion, has rejected the defense request to deduct additional time spent by Mr. Hassan in detention in Mali since 21 April 2017. Today's sentencing judgment may be appealed by Mr. Hassan and the prosecution within 30 days. Reparations to victims will be addressed in due course. At this juncture, the Chamber would like to thank all of the parties and participants, as well as all the staff from the registry, for their tireless efforts during this trial. The Chamber also wishes to convey its special thanks to the members of the public and the victims watching here today in the public gallery and online from Mali and around the world. Thank you. This concludes today's hearing.
All rise, we will await.